Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, May 10th, 2021. Yes, okay, I think so. Well, I'll never get used to that, and I think quarantine and COVID and pandemic has done that in forever. Plenty to catch up on today, and I think Greg Dworkin is operating on a 80% installed new computer, although maybe perhaps some parts of the old computer that carried him through the first 800 years of the program still operating today, almost entirely delivered and installed. But I think, all the Raft O stories are standing by. The Raft, yes, I guess is the one that's standing by. The stories are the ones standing on the raft. So just to get the right grammar together today for today's program. I don't know. Maybe I won't do it. It's just not coming today. All right. Let's see. Plenty to round up. Plenty of fake outrage to keep up with. You got to, check the news each morning to see what Republicans and Republicans alone are angry about this morning. It's been really interesting watching them. I think with the new, more efficient outrage machines that they're working with, it seems to be the case that they are able to spread outrage among, I don't know what you would call them, I guess opinion leaders, thought leaders, I don't know if it really rises to the level of thought, among the Republicans, and spread the outrage and get people angry and yelling before the rest of the populace can catch up with what it is that they're angry about. And I'm sure that they think this is great because they're moving with dispatch and getting the drop on Democrats, but for the most part, they are jumping straight past the media, using their social media presence to spread outrage among conservatives and Republicans, even before rank-and-file conservatives and Republicans get any sense of what it is they're supposed to be talking about. So this past weekend, of course, Sunday, Mother's Day, and many of you probably got the chance to visit with your mothers for the first time in, many months, perhaps years plus because of the pandemic. And of course, unfortunately, many of you didn't get the opportunity to visit with your mothers at all, either because they were lost to the pandemic or, perhaps their time came for some other reason many years ago. It's always a touchy subject, but this one, I think, touchier than most, considering that we've lost maybe 500,000 people, possibly as many as 1 million, as new estimates are being proposed. That, perhaps we should catch up with what's the story behind that one. But I now see circulated the possibility that looking at excess deaths in their entirety and at deaths that perhaps were misclassified for various reasons, up to and including Republican governors monkeying with the systems that they have in their respective states, such that far fewer deaths that really should have been chalked up to COVID are reported that way. We may be looking at something on the order of 905,000 COVID deaths, which puts it beyond almost any sane comparison. As you know, we've already passed the number of U.S. forces killed in combat in all wars fought by the United States combined since 1775. Of course, 905,000. For one thing, it gives us the opportunity to include, if you are so inclined, as at least one person in North Carolina was, including Confederate veterans of the Civil War. But, getting us to 905,000, there are very few comparisons that make any sense. But take your pick. Even if you stick with the 600,000 or so that we are now approaching, I think we are in the neighborhood now of 596 and approaching 500, or 595 and approaching 596,000 lost to COVID, according to the Worldometer's figures. You are still talking about, I put it this way, over the weekend, you're talking about a 9/11 every other day for an entire year to get up to the figures that we're talking about having lost according to the more conservative figures. Anyway, so Mother's Day, I mentioned, became a sore point in the middle of all this, where we should probably be focusing on that. Republicans decided, based on what I'm not exactly sure. I think I have perhaps one clue about what might be the provenance of this, but they spent Mother's Day raging online that all Democrats, I guess, were wandering the country wishing people a happy birthing person's day, so as not to be exclusive of, take your pick. I don't know. But I unfortunately, I don't know who's saying it, so I can't be sure exactly what it is that they're trying to say. But I can be sure of who I actually heard say that aloud, and the answer is nobody. But they seem convinced that all Democrats are dedicated to the proposition that yesterday was Birthing Person's Day and no other official name ought to be recognized. They were outraged by it and tweeted it all day long. And I wonder to the edification of whom. I'm curious about actually how many conservatives and Republicans were at home watching this, saying to themselves probably that, well, this is obviously something that they're making fun of Democrats for, but I really have no idea who might have said it or where it came from. But I'm happy to jump on the bandwagon and express my outrage at it having been used by someone I didn't see, hear, or know about. And I'm just wondering whether at some point do they get ahead of themselves and do Republicans just say, I really have no idea what these guys are talking about anymore. And I remain a registered Republican, but it is getting a little frustrating that I can't tell where this nonsense is coming from or who I'm supposed to be mad at with particularity. And it gets hard for me to sustain the outrage unless I have a name to attach to the target. All right. Well, Greg Dworkin is here, and we won't be waiting around any longer, I guess, for the next outrage. I think we're actually up on a new one, which has to do with his area of expertise. Polling and issue polling brings us to the newest outrage that's been created by the polling itself. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. So how's the sound quality?
It's excellent, I think. It sounds really good.
I'm trying not to creak the chair. Abby hasn't barked yet. And this is a completely new computer, which isn't totally set up yet. So I'm still experimenting with it. But I thought I'd give it a shot and see what happens. By the way, I noticed since it was Mother's Day, Ben Shapiro was doing his annual tweet about Mother's Day. Yesterday was Happy Legal Guardian of Unspecified Gender Day. And he picked something stupid like that to do each year. So it's possible that what you were referring to is simply an outgrowth of the crap that he does.
I think so. I mean, at least in part. This is an old joke for them.
Yes.
It doesn't matter whether anyone says
Ben Shapiro makes the same joke every Mother's Day, huh?
Yeah. I saw somebody had a screen cap of like 7 years of his making this same thing. And okay, whatever, it's a theme. But yeah, somebody else picked up and ran with it. And Ted Cruz spent the weekend on it. I think somebody might have said it somewhere.
Right, because there's a pandemic going on and we still have some economic issues and there's infrastructure. And so nothing is more important than focusing on some obscure thing that may or may not have people interested. But because it's an echo chamber, if one conservative says it, everybody says it. Because, you do what you're told. And, maybe Donald Trump will accuse you of having a horse who's a junkie,
Yes, all the important stuff. I noticed, a couple of mass shootings over the weekend, but what drew comment was a horse junkie.
Whoever was covering it said, this mass shooting is the first big mass shooting since, last week.
Yeah, right. Well, we can't get away from that.
In this particular town.
Well, of that caliber. It's, I see. Right, yes. This is a 38 was responsible for this one. The last mass shooting was 225, so no wonder.
So, stuff. What can I say? The two big stories to me, it's not so much the polling issues one. People are trying to get a sense of school as a political issue. Oh. And this has several different ramifications. But the big picture, 20,000 feet look, is that Republicans everywhere are insane.
Yeah.
And the more insane they are, the more beholden to Donald Trump and buying into the big lie, the more worked up they get about the election being stolen, which drives them to become interested in politics, and then you do things like run for school board. I mean, so it all, if you want to look at trickle-down politics, that's it. Then you can look at the individual issues at the school boards and decide whether or not, that's really a political issue. There's issues regarding polling that say that Americans are interested in fairness, but they're not interested in critical race theory teaching. There's articles that say that Americans are still unhappy about the pace of schools reopening, and that's potentially an issue. But the problem there is that it isn't a Democratic, Republican, clean, one side is one and the other side is the other. But you can mash it all together and say, well, the bottom line here is that Democrats are in disarray. And it's got to benefit Republicans because everything does.
I don't see why it shouldn't.
That's what most of the analysis.
Also, horse junkie.
You take a complex situation where you don't really know how it's going to play, and then you decide in advance this is obviously going to benefit Republicans.
Yes, right. And if that's your job, well, as you've said a million times, right?
Yeah.
That's
if you get paid to say that, then that's what you're going to say.
And so they have.
So, I don't know what to make of that, and I wouldn't pay too much attention to it because nobody really knows.
Okay. All right. Well, I ruined that. I paid too much attention to it. A minute.
The bigger picture to me, the big stories are the continuing big lie and how the Republicans push it, and some interesting stories about that. And on the other hand, the pandemic and how that's playing out, and interesting stories about that too. Which one do you want to do first? Door number one or door number two?
Well, how about the political story first today?
Okay, let's do that. This is a political show after all.
Yes.
So, a couple of things. There was a story in the Washington Post about how Trump is ensconced in Mar-a-Lago, and on the one hand, standing up every night and talking to the Mar-a-Lago people with a drum set behind him about how the election was stolen. Everybody's kind of bored of it, but they listen to him because he owns the place. And on the other hand,
throw you out.
making Kevin McCarthy and all the other people, kiss the ring and line up and go there. Ted Cruz and others feel like they can't win without him, but people like Larry Hogan in Maryland feel like they can't win with him. So, obviously Democrats in disarray because everything is good for Republicans. So that's the background for all of this. But this particular piece and another one in the Washington Post, which I'll get to, caught my eye. This one is Republicans aren't just making it harder to vote. They're going after election officials, too. And this is written by Josh Douglas, who's a law professor at the University of Kentucky. And it's, we all know by now the right to vote is under attack. But also under attack are the people who protect that right.
Yes.
Whether it's Pennsylvania during the actual 2020 election, refusing to play the certify-decertify game, whether it was Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, refusing to find extra votes for Trump the way he was asked to.
Right.
If you refuse to do those things, then the MAGA world turns on you, and the Republicans, who you are a member of, kick you out.
Yeah.
So multiple states have passed or are considering new restrictive voting rights and voting rules in response to the big lie that there's a 2020 election that was stolen, and no evidence of fraud for that. But that hasn't stopped unscrupulous politicians in states such as Arizona, which is continuing their ridiculous recount canvas, whatever you want to call it, Georgia, Texas, Florida, and Iowa from considering new strict rules in absentee balloting, the ability to use a drop box, and even providing food or water to voters waiting in line. And they've received a lot of attention, but far less noticed have been provisions in these laws that penalize local election officials who administer the elections.
Yes.
Iowa, for example, will now make it a crime if election workers violate any of the new rules. Florida's enacted a rule that limits drop box availability to only during voting hours and provides that, quote, if any drop box at an early voting site is left accessible for the return of ballots outside of early voting hours, the supervisor is subject to a civil penalty of $25,000.
Oh, well, civil penalty, but still $25,000.
It's a lot of money.
Serious.
Texas' proposed bill would subject a local registrar to fines if the registrar fails to mail out notices demanding proof of citizenship. It would also criminalize election workers who distance or obstruct the view of a poll watcher in a way that makes observation reasonably ineffective.
We know what that one is for.
Arizona legislators want to make it a felony for an election worker to mail an early ballot to a voter who's not requested one.
Put the wrong address on it, go to jail.
Yeah, election officials were already under immense pressure during and after the 2020 election with death threats, armed protesters, etc. And they've also received racist, threatening messages, all because they stood up for democracy. And their predictable result? They're quitting.
Or not helping with democracy.
So they can be replaced with Trumpers. I mean,
Fantastic.
So a lot of this is really, just as we saw in Arizona, these are preambles, these are dry runs, how to steal an election in 2022, 2024.
Yeah. And continuing with the theme for Republicans, essentially anything that they run into, when the law turns out to be against them, they say, oh, well, not only do we want to change the law, but we should also change the law such that, if we have the control of the legislature, people who tell us what the law is should be imprisoned. And, wow.
Yeah, and anybody who wrote the previous law that we didn't like, they should go to jail too. I mean, It's amazing stuff.
Stand your
that's
ground
only a
for
slight exaggeration
elections.
to what they're doing.
It's not at all an exaggeration. I jumped out, or one that jumped out to me in particular was, I guess, for all the people who were elections monitors or were observing the counts of the vote in these various states, whom we now say, well, they were able to gather no evidence of fraud. Though they allege widespread fraud, they couldn't find any evidence of it. The people who were watching vote counts happen and saying, I want to get up at this table and put it under a microscope and run UV light and look for bamboo fibers, and the official counters are saying, no, you're getting in the way, you're ruining the chain of custody and contaminating our ballots. The people who are keeping us from breaking the law and contaminating the ballots ought to be thrown in jail for preventing me from accessing the ballots. That's what they're doing now. They're now passing these things. Whether they stand up or not, well, not one, we'll wait and see. But two, they don't care. That's very exciting to them to pass these laws. And of course, if they're invalidated, it's an activist judge who needs to be impeached and possibly killed. So you know how that game goes. But yeah, I keep thinking of this in terms of stand your ground for everything else. They just don't like being caught up in proving that they're doing something legal and that they're allowed to do this sort of thing. And it bothers them that they're called to account. So they make whatever illegality they engage in legal, and whatever legal protections others engage in to stop them illegal. And if you control the state legislature, you can do it.
The abbreviated version of this is simply something we've been saying all along, and that is that the only thing that Republicans are interested in is keeping power. They have no interest in governance. They have no interest in policy. All they want to do is keep power. So how do they do this? Well, step one, get sympathetic judges. Step two, pass ridiculous laws that empower themselves and screw the opposition. Step three, when challenged, send those laws to step one so that they can be validated. Yeah. And step four, you lose. I mean, that's the project.
Pretty much, and frightening that they're doing that, and that I don't know. It keeps being restated that people aren't noticing. I think people are beginning to, but
again,
not as much as the water
bottle. The media
bottle
is covering this, but only sporadically. Yeah. Again, we talked on the show last week about a local outlet in Pennsylvania which makes election fraud and the big lie central to everything that they do, which is vital. So playing this, as media often does, is a both sides thing. And by the way, it's interesting that what the Republicans are doing is trying to screw democracy, and it just might work, Chuck Todd style. Is bad. You shouldn't be talking about whether or not this person has a chance of winning without also mentioning, by the way, there's no way that they should.
Yeah, because they're an insurrectionist.
Because they're insurrectionists and they're anti-democracy, and that's part of the picture. And why did you leave that out?
Yes, right. And shout out to you mentioned it last week, and I saw it retweeted this weekend. Kyle Griffin using his high-volume Twitter account to give kudos to WITF, the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania radio station that you told us was running disclaimers anytime they talked about news involving a Republican who had voted to overturn the election results.
This is WTF Radio, and we have another WTF thing to give to you.
Like, you're not going to believe this one.
WTF happened here.
Yeah.
What are they doing?
Well, good work on their part. Hope they're a model for everyone else.
The Washington Post also has a difficult to read, and I don't mean difficult because it's emotional or you have to turn away. It's difficult because the technology makes it difficult to read. They decided that they were going to put all sorts of fancy graphics on it, which makes it difficult to read. It doesn't always scroll properly. But the Washington Post has a piece called "The Making of a Myth." Russell Ramsland Jr. sold everything from Tex-Mex to light therapy technology, and then he sold the story the 2020 election was stolen from Trump.
Oh, yeah, this guy, okay.
Very interesting story. A key element of the baseless claim actually came from this one guy. And he had a meeting in 2018 after midterm losses in Texas, and Russell Ramsland and his associates delivered alarming presentations on electronic voting to a procession of conservative lawmakers trying to get them to buy into the idea that the voting machines were fraudulent.
Yes.
We had to find the right candidate, said Laura Presley, a former Ramsland ally, whose own claim that audit logs showed fraud had been rejected in court 2 years early. We had to find one who knew they won, and they made the pitch to a number of them, and then finally nobody would agree to a challenge, and the idea of widespread vote manipulation remained on the political fringe until 2020 when Trump bought into it. And this paragraph, the enduring myth that the 2020 election was rigged, was not one claim by one person. It was many claims stacked atop the other, repeated by a phalanx of Trump allies, and the previously unreported origin story of a core set of these claims, ideas that were advanced not by renowned experts or by insiders who had knowledge, but by Ramsland and his fellow conservatives as they pushed a fledgling company, Allied Security Operations Group, into a quixotic attempt to find evidence of widespread fraud where none existed. And to assemble a picture of the company's role, the Washington Post obtained emails and company documents and interviewed 12 people with direct knowledge. Many spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss private matters out of fear of retribution. 3 individuals who were present in the hangar for those 2018 meetings spoke about gatherings publicly for the first time. And so these are the kind of people that influence Rudy Giuliani and all the other claims about stop the steal and insurrection followed. So it's an important origin piece in that regard. But it's all a lie. It's a big lie. It's garbage.
Yeah. And you see how much of it is this guy's responsibility. It is and interesting. It's curious how you'd think, well, how do you sustain yourself for 6, 10, 12 years being the guy whose job it is to lie about how elections are consulted? Like, who pays for that? And it's not entirely clear that anybody does. But
there was some crazy stuff on the left. You know, you go back to 2008. And Ohio and black box voting and whether or not the votes were manipulated. But it died out because it was stupid and nobody really, wanted to follow it. And people were trying to grift off of it. And that works for, a couple of months, couple of years and then stops. Not with these guys. It just goes on and on and on and on and on.
I guess somebody just keeps sending them money to live on. Like, I don't know. What does this company
do? But again, you get back to the 20,000 picture here and it's a 2-part problem. Part number 1 is Trump was elected and then adopted this mantra. Yeah. And number 2, both media and Republican officials pay attention to what he says.
Yeah.
That's the dangerous part there. Right? He's a nut job. He's a conspiracy theorist. And yet, because he was president, it became Overton window style mainstream discussion when it never should have.
Part, yes. Pardon me. Yeah, well, that's true. And it actually reminds me a little bit of people who hung on the fringes and somehow made a living running around with getting grants from the Department of Homeland Security to train local police departments in such tactics as arrest every Muslim because they're all members of the Muslim Brotherhood and therefore terrorists. And I have proof, and it's the book I wrote and self-published yesterday. And here it is, and you should buy 100,000 copies of it and give it to every officer on the force. And then they sort of seamlessly, I think, moved into or used the same operating theory to just become election fraud experts instead of terrorism experts. And they barnstorm around the country taking small checks from small Republican organizations around the country until, we'll just hang on this way until we can elect a complete lunatic. And then we'll see if things get better.
And, the other nice thing about this particular story about the Texas guy who started the Stop the Steal idea is that the story draws a direct line. Well, it says here, the nation's embrace of electronic voting grew out of the debacle of 2000. When true. Hanging chads and other hard-to-interpret paper ballots muddled the outcome of the presidential race, souring many Americans on the analog technology the country had used for decades. Yes. So 2 years later, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act. Billions of dollars went into modernized U.S. elections, encouraged jurisdictions to replace the old voting machines with new digital systems. So then we had paperless touchscreen voting machines, or DREs, direct recording electronic voting machines. Remember them? They're simpler, they're cheaper, they're more accessible to people with disabilities. And so then there were security risks associated with that. So, this is evolution. Nobody's specifically responsible for it. On the other hand, I just think it's interesting to say that, well, the whole thing about electronic voting and the security issues really came out of the fact that there was a Republican organized Brooks Brothers riot in 2000 when George Bush tried to steal that election.
It's weird that they keep creating problems that work so well for them.
Yeah, that's, kind of interesting, ain't it?
And, and of course watching people watch, it's always funny to watch proposed reforms cause problems of their own, as these electronic voting machines
that's okay. Did. If you have people on both sides who are, in good faith trying to do this, you work those out. Problem is one side doesn't do it in good faith.
Right. Right. And if they do it on purpose to drive their issue into the consciousness of America, sometimes it works. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Many things to continue with here, so let's see. We laid out a game plan during the break, but we have more politics to deal with first, I think, before we get on to why you're all still in your houses.
So AP Norc has a poll out this morning. Biden approval buoyed by his pandemic response. Julie Pace, who is summarizing it for Twitter, said, new AP poll out this morning, Biden's overall approval rating sits at 63%. When it comes to the new president's handling of the pandemic, 71% approve, including 47% of Republicans. The fact is the numbers are going down in the pandemic. We'll get to that. That's important.
Which numbers
they're not as low as we want them. There's some issues, but for the most part, things are getting better. Everybody knows it, and Biden's getting credit for it.
Okay, so the pandemic numbers going down, numbers for dealing with the pandemic, therefore, going up.
Right.
Okay.
So people are arguing about what to do and what it means, but there are less cases, less hospitalizations. Tony Fauci was saying over the weekend he expects that mask indoor guidance will lighten up and doesn't expect a resurgence in the fall to any extent like we saw this year. However, there's still going to be pockets of issues.
All right.
So, Biden's getting credit for all of that. So I think, it's just important to say that every time the Republicans turn to some obscure issue to try to make it into a culture war thing, be it the schools or the border. Remember the border? Nobody's talking about the border. Yeah. That was last week's big issue that was going to change the 2022 election. Nobody's talking about that. Or kicking out Liz Cheney, And Lee Stefanik's rise is coupled by the fact that the conservatives hate her, MAGA people hate her, everybody hates her. Wow. But the point is she'll do what Kevin McCarthy says, and Kevin McCarthy will do what Donald Trump says, and that's all that matters. So those are last week's issues that were going to change everything. And this week, it's unclear what it is, and none of it is really hurting Biden.
Whoops, yes.
That was you, not me.
Yeah, right. That was
those
me.
Of you at home, don't do what David did.
Right, I didn't. I don't know what you're talking about. I deny the whole thing.
You didn't see it.
Yeah, right.
I know you didn't see it because this is radio.
Pics or it didn't happen, everybody.
Right.
Sorry about that.
Now, another story here I think was of interest. A Pennsylvania lawmaker and the resurgence of Christian nationalism. How Doug Mastriano's rise embodies the spread of a movement centered on the belief that God intended America to be a Christian nation.
Oh.
So when you have the whole big, plan to put judges in that'll rule your way, then screw people, then when challenged, take it to the judges, then win, so you lose. This is part of that project.
Okay. I mean, bad, but I get you.
Trump's electoral loss as a religious battle against the forces of evil. There's a set of beliefs characterized as Christian nationalism, which center on the idea that God intended America to be a Christian nation, and which, when mingled with conspiracy theory and white nationalism, helped to fuel the insurrection. Violence has always been a part of Christian nationalism. Andrew Whitehead, a sociologist and co-author of Taking America Back for God, told me. It's just that the nature of the enemy has changed. So this fellow, Doug Mastriano, who's in the Pennsylvania part of Pennsylvania,
sounds familiar.
He grew up in New Jersey in a military family.
Maybe that's why.
And just got into the whole idea that God is helping us to, kill Muslims and take back the world for Christianity.
Easy to do in New Jersey.
Right.
I don't know.
In 2019, after retiring from the military and teaching at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Mastriano decided to run for office. And prominent members of the group New Apostolic Reformation, a loosely linked network of charismatic and Pentecostals, over the past decade has played an influential role in conservative American circles. Mastriano denied working directly with them, but many members believe that God speaks to them directly. They've been tasked with battling real-world demons who control global leaders. Prominent members in the group go by the title apostle or prophet to hark back to early Christianity, and the overarching agenda to return the U.S. to an idealized Christian past is largely built upon the work of pseudo-historian David Barton, who's advanced the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation. So Mastriano's significance is that he's attempting to create a theonomy, a system of enacting God's law on earth. Frederick Clarkson, research analysis at Political Research Associates, told me bills that Mastriano supported in the legislature would have mandated teaching the Bible in public schools, would have made it illegal for adoption agencies to discriminate against same-sex couples, among other things. And as lockdowns took hold, Mastriano railed against what he saw as the curtailment of God-given freedoms. It says in John 8:36 that if Jesus set you free, you are free indeed. That's why my motto is walk as free people. And then he suggested his viewers find new congregations if their pastors weren't leading in-person worship services in the middle of the pandemic.
Cool. That's odd.
So this ties in the
that could get to be a prophet.
The white evangelical vaccine refusal with a worldview that says basically, if you try to enact public health things that save people's lives, you're interfering with God's will.
Yes, well, that seems pretty obvious. It's all written down in one of those ancient tablets, probably.
Right. Exactly.
Weird. Okay, we'll be on the lookout, I guess. I just... I like it. They promote you very quickly. If you join this, you're a prophet right away.
Right. Good. Anyway, it's a long story about that, and I thought it was sort of kind of interesting. But again, there's this intersection.
Yes.
Between politics and evangelical support for Republicans, and evangelical rejection of vaccines and what's going on with public health measures, trying to save people's lives. That's just awfully interesting. Again, that's not to say that public health folks always get everything right or that what they're doing can't be challenged. But this goes beyond that. This is the same thing as I don't accept the election because the results were wrong, and God told me I won, so why should I listen to anything you say?
Well, yeah. I mean, once God tells you, there's very little you can do about it otherwise. I see Boogaloo Boys make a appearance in this mix somehow, too. I just see
it's all together.
Article. I guess.
And then Mastriano said he was heading to Washington, D.C. and calling out to God for divine revelation 2 days before the Capitol riots.
Okay.
He used campaign funds to charter 6 buses to shuttle followers to Washington, D.C., told them he would speak on the Capitol steps, and then rioters broke in the Capitol, some wielding Bibles and Jesus 2020 signs, appealed to heaven flags, and chauffeurs.
Jesus 2020 flags.
Right.
They had that?
On the Senate floor, one insurrectionist called out from the dais, Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Another thanked God for filling this chamber with patriots. And later that evening, Mastriano appeared on Facebook Live for his fireside chat looking spooked. He told viewers he had left the Capitol after he saw things get weird.
Really?
When it was apparent it was no longer a peaceful protest, my wife and I left the area.
Yeah, all right. Well, so he's trying not to get arrested.
So I instigated it, but it's not on me because I left when things got weird.
What are you doing? Yeah, all right. Well, okay, he's trying to stay out of jail. That's the first sensible thing I've heard him say all day.
Right. So he's toned down the rhetoric since then. He doesn't talk as much about, taking back the country. But it is what it is. And so, it's an important piece that, ties together. He's not alone. If he were alone, it would just be that, interesting people story.
Yeah. It does remind me that.
But there's a strain of this that runs very deep in MAGA world. And so it's worth paying attention to. Just like the guy Texas with the Stop the Steal origin stories.
Yeah, well, I like the idea that he's got his own flag and he's trying to take over the country and wants to enact God's law on earth. There was a guy we know, you and I both, who wrote a book and was pilloried among the liberal intelligentsia for labeling these people as American Taliban some time ago. That's going too far. You need to be reaching across the aisle and working with these people on bipartisan compromise. And then they found a lunatic and took over the country.
Yeah,
and,
pretty
they
much.
never really acknowledged that they were coming.
So, turning to the pandemic,
yes.
Going from good news to good news.
Yeah, fun.
The nutcases are taking over the country and the virus is taking over the world. So what's happening is that the vaccines are doing okay in the United States, and the numbers here are coming down, but around the world, not so much. India, obviously, with big issues, Latin America having issues. Yeah. Experts now say the virus is changing too quickly, new, more contagious variants are spreading too easily, and vaccinations are happening too slowly for herd immunity, otherwise known as community immunity, to be within reach anytime soon. And that means if the virus continues to run rampant through much of the world, it's well on its way to becoming endemic and ever-present threat. That means it's established and it just keeps coming back like flu seasons do, except worse. Virus variants are tearing through places where people gather in large numbers with few or no pandemic protocols. Keep that in mind. It isn't just the vaccines. You also have to do what's called NPI's non-pharmaceutical interventions, like wearing masks and distancing. According to David Heyman, Heymann, more about him in a minute.
Get a grogger.
A professor of infectious disease epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Now, David Heyman is in public health circles like a hero and legendary figure. He led the fight to eradicate smallpox around the world.
Oh, that's nice of him.
And knows a thing or two about infectious diseases. While the outbreak in India, and I actually did some work with him, sort of. That is to say, attended meetings with him and discussed pandemic flu preparations back in the 2007-2008 era.
Okay.
So I know him, and he's great.
All right.
I mean, he's like Mr. Rogers became a doctor. While the outbreak in India is capturing the most attention, Dr. Heyman said the pervasive reach of the virus means that the likelihood is growing that it will persist in most parts of the world. As more people contract the virus, developing some level of immunity, and the pace of vaccinations accelerates, future outbreaks won't be on the scale of those devastating India and Brazil, Dr. Heyman said. Smaller outbreaks that are less deadly, but a constant threat should be expected. That's what we're looking at here. So on the whole, things are getting better in the United States, but hotspots like Oregon or Michigan last month are going to continue to pop up. There's some study now looking at what happened early on in the pandemic in Texas with the too soon reopening of Texas schools, coupled with now that your kids are back in school and you're free to do things, the parents go out and play, and they go out in the community and ignore all the other non-pharmaceutical interventions. All of that helped virus spread in Texas. So these and again, in Israel, which is having a great pandemic response, largely due to their vaccine program, but also due to the fact that they were not hesitant about doing lockdowns, real lockdowns, not like the United States did,
they do a lot of things.
when it was called for. All of these things together help. We know it helps, but there remains resistance to doing it for various and sundry reasons. Some of them are real and legitimate, like my restaurant business can't afford to do this, and some are not legitimate, like, Republicans don't wear masks and don't get vaccinated, but Democrats do because screw the other side. So again, it's a complex mix. People are complicated. There's no one thing that makes something work or not work. There's a lot about the virus we still don't understand, but we do know a lot of things about the virus that we didn't know before. And one of the things we know is you can't just throw away your mask and run, crazy while the virus is still in your community, because it's going to come back and it's going to surge, as it has in Oregon, as it did in Michigan.
Yep.
So you got to be careful, even though things are loosening up. And as more people get vaccinated, you can do more things, but that requires more people to be vaccinated. And so, you're getting ahead of yourself when you say, I see the path to it being over, and therefore it's over. No, you have a lot more work to do before it's over, although you could see the path.
Right. I see the path, but I'm not on it, or I haven't walked.
I'm on it, but I haven't come to the end.
This doesn't work any better.
So I think I'll
just
sit down.
I see the treadmill
right here in the middle of the woods and have some coffee, even though there isn't any, because I could see at the end of the trail there's a little coffee house.
Yeah. Well, like I was saying,
serve me here.
I can see the treadmill, but I haven't lost any weight.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right. I think that makes sense as a metaphor.
So two stories that go along with that, which I think are important. One is how you do it right. This is the Wall Street Journal. How a Canadian province contained the Brazilian COVID-19 variant. British Columbia quickly imposed limits on indoor activities and used genomic surveillance to identify where vaccines were most needed. So they did the vaccine thing, but they also did the non-pharmaceutical intervention thing. I so much prefer that term to lockdowns, because they're not really lockdowns. They're simply saying don't be stupid and go to a bar and yell at your friends in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah,
and don't sing to them while you're there.
Yes, right. I mean, I haven't felt locked in some time, but I guess we needed a better term for it. Maybe a shorter one than that, but that's certainly more accurate. Non-pharmaceutical
NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, the term that's existed forever. Because that's what they are, and that's what they should be called.
Yeah. All right, and I like it. A little acronym.
Anyway, British Columbia did it, and it worked. And then the other piece, which is a wonderful rant by one of my favorite authors, Zeynep Tufekci, who's been writing common sense things since the pandemic started.
Yes.
She's more of a sociologist and less of an infectious disease person, therefore not hampered by convention.
I guess that's true.
And started talking early on about the fact that people around the world wear masks, and why aren't Americans wearing masks? There's no reason not to. And so today's essay, why did it take so long to accept the facts about COVID?
I don't know.
A few sentences have shaken a century of science. A week ago, more than a year after the World Health Organization declared we face a pandemic, a page on its website titled Coronavirus Disease, How is it Transmitted, got a seemingly small update.
All right.
The agency's response to the question, how it's transmitted, had been, current evidence suggests the main way the virus spreads is by respiratory droplets, which are expelled from the mouth and quickly fall to the ground among people who are in close contact with each other. That's the whole 6 feet and 15 minutes thing.
Right.
Why 6 feet? Because if they fall directly to the ground, then you're not at risk if you're further than that.
Right.
And that's been the response from CDC and WHO for a year. The revised response still emphasizes transmission in close contact, but now says it could be with aerosols. Smaller respiratory particles that float as well as droplets. It also adds a reason the virus can also be transmitted in poorly ventilated and crowded indoor settings, saying this is because aerosols remain suspended in the air or travel further than a meter.
Yes.
Approximately 3 feet. The change didn't get a lot of attention. There was no news conference, no big announcement. And then on Friday, the CDC updated its guidance on COVID-19, clearly saying inhalation of these smaller particles is a key way the virus is transmitted, even at close range, and puts it on top of its list of how the disease spreads. No news conference, but they did it. And these latest shifts challenge key infection control assumptions that go back a century, putting a lot of what went wrong last year in context. They also may signal one of the most important advancements in public health during the pandemic. Because if the importance of aerosol transmission had been accepted early, we would have been told from the beginning it was much safer outdoors, as long as you avoid close, prolonged contact with others. We would have tried to make sure indoor spaces are well ventilated with air filters as necessary. And instead of blanket rules on gatherings, we would have targeted conditions that can produce super spreading events, people in poorly ventilated indoor space, especially if engaged over time. So you're allowed, Sturgis, you're just not allowed to party afterwards, indoors. You're allowed to go out on the beach in Florida. You're just not allowed to go to the restaurants afterwards. Mm-hmm. Okay? Shouting and singing, bad. You have justification for stay in church if you want to. Just skip those things.
I guess so.
Well, you know, God said that if you had the freedom, then you could. Well, no.
Oh, well, there you go.
We would have started using masks more quickly. We would have paid more attention to their fit. We would have been less obsessed with cleaning surfaces. There are still libraries today that if you borrow a book, you return it to them, and 3 days later, they'll either clean it or put it back on the shelf.
Yes.
Totally unnecessary. Schools still do this deep cleaning thing as if it's going to help your kids. Totally unnecessary and a waste of money.
Yes.
Your money, your taxpayer money.
But people get paid to clean. That's nice.
Right? So since the pandemic's far from over, with countries like India facing devastating surges, we need to understand both why this took so long and what it will mean. And because it was seen as a droplet thing, everything was keyed around that. And the implications of this were illustrated when I, Zeynep Tufekci, visited New York City in late April. A giant digital billboard greeted me at Times Square. Protect yourself. Guidance from WHO. Hygiene. Practice respiratory hygiene. Don't touch your face. Wear a mask. Social distancing. Avoid close contact. Medical help. Follow local medical protocols. And stay informed. But it didn't say anything about it's airborne and act accordingly. Oh. Not a word about ventilation. Nothing about opening windows. And again, remember, they knew this in 1918.
Yeah.
Right? The whole reason that New York City, heaters, those apartment heaters, the ones that are next to the window, were designed to be hot.
Like way hot.
Because the windows were supposed to be open.
Yes. They're way hotter than they were supposed to be, and they're stifling if you keep the windows closed. So people open the windows. But the windows
are supposed to open, and so this was designed to keep the place warm, even though the windows were open.
Yeah. New York.
And why? Because you're supposed to open the windows. And why? Ventilation.
Yeah.
And why? Because flu is airborne.
Right. Yeah. The only
this is 1918. They knew that then.
When they had windows that opened. That made sense. Yeah. My only objection to some of the things that she has to say, they're all correct. It's just I wondered, giving this sort of information out to a country that no longer has windows that open and that mostly occupies a space where it doesn't work.
That's part of the point here.
Yeah.
The reason that reasoning was stifled is because it would be too expensive to retrofit. That you'd have to start thinking about how do you open windows.
Right.
That you'd have to spend money on the schools to actually make them ventilated. You'd have to deal with these sick building syndromes.
Yeah.
And
that would be nice.
People didn't want to do that.
No. And couldn't in many places.
Well, that's different than I don't want to.
Well, that's true.
Right? If you say, I need to do these things, but I can't because I have these limitations, so I have to do indoor other things. I have to get better filters. I have to do this. I have to do that, which is very different than if you can't open the windows, do it, and spend the money on the better filters, not on deep cleaning
yes.
surfaces, because that's not how it's spread.
Yeah. Well,
okay. Mary Louise McLaws, an epidemiologist at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, as opposed to Old South Wales.
Yeah, I hate those
and a
guys.
member of the WHO committee that crafts infection prevention and control guidance, wanted all this examined, but knew the stakes made it hard to overcome the resistance. She told the Times last year, if we started revisiting airflow, we'd have to be prepared to change a lot of what we do. It's a good idea, but it would cause an enormous shudder through the Infection Control Society.
And the rest.
Okay. And the assumption that the larger droplets can travel only a few feet as the main way the disease spread is one of the key reasons why CDC didn't recommend masks at first. Why bother if you could just walk further away?
I guess.
Right?
Yeah.
The WHO last updated its mask guidance in December, but continued to insist that mask use indoors was not necessary if people could remain separated. In contrast, if the aerosols had been considered a major form of transmission, in addition to distancing and masks, advice would have centered on ventilation and airflow, as well as time spent indoors. So then we got all these studies about where do you sit in the restaurant compared to the air conditioning and who gets sick from which table. That's all because it's airborne.
Yeah.
Same thing on a plane.
Yes.
Right? So maybe there is some benefit in keeping that middle seat empty, even though it hurts your bottom line. I mean, there's a number of reasons why people didn't want to hear this.
Yeah. Well,
but it also means that indoors, 3 or even 6 feet, while helpful, is not completely protective, especially over time. And meanwhile, many countries allowed their indoor workplaces to open, but with inadequate aerosol protection. No attention to ventilation, installing air filters, opening windows when possible. And it was more about just stay 6 feet apart and time yourself. Mm-hmm. Or put these hard plastic barriers, which actually may be useless and make things worse.
Yes. Well,
those plastic shields, those giant plastic shields. Why? Because they're droplet protection, when in fact it's an aerosol problem.
Yes.
The virus just like goes over and around, you know?
It does. But it's a
waste of money.
Around.
So, you know, do the things that the point is, if you don't know what you're doing, you waste a lot of money instead of doing the things that help.
Yeah, but that's what we're supposed to do with our time. Waste money.
Right.
Do nothing.
So, you know, I think it's an important observation.
It is.
And, you know, it should guide some of our policies going forward. You know, it's slow, but at least done. So, let's see. It's just going through how WHO finally got to this decision. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. But, you know, I will point out there's a lot of the aerosol experts, PhDs in aerosol science, who've been saying this for months and months and months on Twitter and other places, saying, consult us. We know what's going on here. Your expertise may have been in some other area in infectious disease, but not this. And your infection control people may even have some other expertise in some other subject altogether. And include us in the discussions because it's important.
Yeah, well, I think they did a good job with it. They broke through the official lag in adopting their information. I feel like for the most part, people who paid attention to pandemic news have heard them for a long time. I mean,
here's an example. In a contemporary example of this attitude, the initial public health report on a Mount Vernon choir breakout.
Oh, yes, right.
Said it may have been caused by people, quote, sitting close to one another, sharing snacks and stacking chairs at the end of the practice, end quote.
Yes.
Even though almost 90% of the people there developed symptoms. Shelley Miller, an aerosol expert at the University of Colorado Boulder, was so struck by the incident she initiated a study with a team of scientists documenting the space was less full than usual, allowing for increased distance. Nobody reported touching anybody else. Hand sanitizer was used. Only 3 people who had arrived early arranged chairs. There was no spatial pattern. There was no airflow obvious problem here, but airflow must have been it because it wasn't where they were standing. And there was nobody within 9 feet in front of the first known case who had mild symptoms. Mm-hmm. And Galileo is said to have murmured, and yet it moves, after he was forced to recant his theory that the Earth moved around the sun. And scientists who study bioaerosols could only say, yet it floats.
Yeah. Right.
So, you know, there's concrete examples of people insisting it must be because you touched a surface. No, it's because you breathe the air. Well, that's much more difficult. That's going to be much more expensive. Well, Nonetheless, it floats.
True. Although, yeah, like rough, that's why I was sort of like, well, some of the rough responses that we came up with, like let's have limitations on gatherings. Well, I understand that it's not 100% effective because it's not really droplet spread, but that also has the effect of keeping many, many people out of aerosolized clouds of virus.
Right. There's some advantages. I mean, again, if you catch it because you're close, it could be aerosol or droplet. If you defend against COVID, you might decrease flu spread. I mean, there's benefits you have from doing some of these things, but still, you have to have the basic understanding of where it all comes from so that you can most efficiently direct your efforts, your funds, and your resources.
Yes.
Again, closing outdoor stuff down is bad, not good, because it keeps people indoors, which is bad, not good.
Yeah, typically, I mean, they'll spread inside the houses. But if people were observing those rules, then there would at least be limited to discrete houses, and you could deal with treating the people there. It's a tough mix. I mean, it's the science now, I guess, becomes clear. The sociology, which I guess is actually Tufekci's original area of expertise, I think is a little bit more difficult. Like the idea that she's very high on the idea of, well, we should have allowed the beaches to be open and stop shaming people for going to the beach. True. And then, well, see, the real problem is, of course, that people go to the bars afterwards. But they should just not do that. But they're human and they do. And so in some cases, this leads us back to the masking problem. Masks, it'll work, but if you don't know how to take them on and off properly, it could become a problem. Similarly, beaches, not a problem.
So we spent a lot of time doing doffing and
yes.
That sort of thing.
Right.
Anyway, that's it for today. Interesting stuff. She also, has a lot to say about the anti-vax stuff, which surprised even her as a sociologist.
Oh.
But we'll be back on Wednesday. We'll talk about some of this other stuff and whatever happened between now and then. Glad the computer worked, and
yes, me too.
We'll take it from there.
Thanks, Greg. Sounding very good. Good luck with the rest of the computer install. See you on Wednesday.
Working on it. Talk to you Wednesday.
Okay, and thanks, and a little extended segment there, and welcome back everybody else to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, and a little bit of extra Greg here. We're very excited about the new computer setup, but he's, you could go on for hours just on the computer setup. Very interesting to hear the struggles of getting all the cabling correct, and all of the new and improved methods of connecting computers to your various peripherals, I guess, lead you with things where you have one version or one generation of connecting cable on one end of the brand new computer, but the not brand new monitor uses the older style of cabling. And yes, there are adapters, but apparently it doesn't work all that well. So every time they improve connectivity, they actually ruin it for the most part. But okay. And here I thought we were moving into the era of universal connectivity with the whatevers. Anyway, but Apple, it seems, is very interested in. I mean, I guess that's a thing for them too, right? If you change the connection methodology and the shape of the connectors every once in a while, then you have to end up buying new equipment. And if you take the middle road and buy the adapters, that only goes so far. So, all right, well, then you have to buy an entirely new piece of equipment, and they make a lot more money. I think that, I guess that makes a certain amount of sense. All right, well, let's see. Good luck to him, and he has until Wednesday to try and hammer out some new solutions. I'm sure, but it sounded great, so it just didn't look that good on his monitor, which is fine because it's radio. But hopefully things will be straightened out between then and now. Yeah, we were discussing even into the break, though. I'm very interested in what it is that Zeynep Tufekci has had to say in all of this, and it's been a weird thing following her. Like it seems to me strange that there's this blind spot as the sociologist. I mean, she seems very excited to have discovered the science of how the aerosols work, because that's sort of outside of her formal training, and it's been exciting to her to see it gotten right and see it explain the phenomenon of the spread of the disease. But then the sociology part of it seems like it has suffered. She was very, as I was saying before the break, she was very much into the idea that closing outdoor spaces at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's been a long time since that was the case. But originally, you know, the thought was, I guess, maybe driven by droplet spread theory. But quite honestly, I think if you had told a lot of people that it's even worse, it spreads via aerosols and can travel much further than 6 feet, I don't know that that would have, in the initial phases of the pandemic response, have resulted in more open outdoor spaces. You could have made the case for the idea that, well, airflow outside and, you know, of course, the volume of air available to you in a non-enclosed space means that even though the virus is airborne and aerosolized, the chances of transmission are much lower because, the air currents are moving, and aerosolized virus doesn't hang around in a cloud and a miasma around the people gathering if they're gathering outdoors. I mean, it might not. It probably won't. But we didn't really know that for sure. And two, it wouldn't have surprised me if that had been brought up, that the experts might have said, oh, even worse, it can spread further than 6 feet. So outdoor gathering isn't necessarily all that safe after all. And then once they realized, all right, well, it's true that aerosolized virus can travel much further than 6 feet, and, people aren't even distancing outdoors, it's still mostly the case that I guess you have to sit there and be covered in, the aerosolized virus for some extended period of time in order to add up to the kind of viral load it takes to actually have an infection take root with somebody. And that just isn't likely to happen in ever-shifting eddies of air currents that you find outside but not inside. And so she was very outspoken in saying we really shouldn't be closing these outdoor spaces. But it seems to me that by late last year, we had pretty much given up on the idea of closing these outdoor spaces and had begun to adopt the idea that, the airflow outside, whether we believe it's airborne or not, I think everybody by that point probably was convinced that it was, even though officialdom wouldn't say that it was. And that creates a whole separate area of problems, that people come to understand the disease better and at a faster rate, or at least, practically what to do about the disease, some people, than officialdom. And then other people who never really came to understand things at all then use that as an excuse not to listen to guidance that happens to be correct from the experts. Well, why should I listen to them? They were wrong about it being airborne. Well, that's true, but you were also wrong about it being airborne, or you never understood what it meant for it to be airborne in the first place. Or you pretended you did because Zeynep Tufekci told you, and, glad you read it and understood it, that being on the beach was okay. And then you ignored the footnote, which was being on the beach is okay, but because of the way you conduct yourself at the beach, you were then putting yourself in danger afterwards by going bar hopping at the beach, because that's part of the beach experience for you. And Zeynep Tufekci, super expert person, said going to the beach was okay. Yeah, but she said, she was talking about being on the sand and outside. Very windy, very difficult, I'm sure, to pick up a full viral load to make you sick, almost no matter how crowded the beaches are. Although, I suppose, if the beaches are really and truly packed, You can see disruptions in the airflow by, the number of people around and the shelters that they set up and the umbrellas, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever, you don't even have to go into the bars. But then when you do go into the bars or into the changing rooms or into the ice cream places, whatever it is, I didn't go into a single bar. That's true, but you went in, you took the kids to an ice cream place and got sick there. It doesn't have to be a bar. It's just got to be an indoor space. And the hotel that you stayed in, or whatever it is, any number of things. It's just, you get it's very well explained, and she tells you all about aerosolized virus and how being in outdoor spaces is relatively safe. But if you don't then avoid all the places that she tells you pretty clearly are not safe, it's not going to work. And then you're going to blame it on, well, she said it was safe to go to the beach. It was. It's just, and she was pretty clear about where not to go after. I know, but I didn't read or didn't care about that part, because when I think of beach, right, like I said, same as donning and doffing the masks. I wore a mask. You said I should wear a mask. It would keep me safe. Yeah, but you licked it when you were done, and you took it off wrong and then patted your face dry with your bare hands, and that creates a problem. But masks, you say, yeah, well, you didn't read the whole thing, or you didn't grasp the whole thing. And it's funny, because that's, I think, what drove a lot of the early discouragement of masking, was that there were people who, I think it might have been an overreaction, but who warned, yeah, we could find some people getting themselves infected by doing the things improperly that we say might otherwise have protected you from the spread of the virus. And I would have thought that a sociologist would have been more attuned to the possibility, but maybe she was, and I didn't read her work correctly. But I would have thought there would have been more emphasis on, I can tell you to do the right thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean, and never has necessarily meant, that you would do the right thing. And I could explain to you why it is the right thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll read it or grasp it, even if you do. So, I don't know. But she's been right about that. But I also feel like for many months since, people have come to understand that outdoor activity is a lot safer, even if the CDC wouldn't say so quickly enough. And I guess the other example that was offered up, like Sturgis, well, you can have Sturgis, but you can't go to the bars afterwards, but that's Sturgis. You can't have Sturgis, because what people go to Sturgis for, it's not to ride around in fresh air. You can ride your motorcycle anywhere. It's to ride your motorcycle in large numbers and then fraternize afterwards, usually in spaces that are unsafe where aerosolized virus is being circulated. But if you tell people, well, you can have Sturgis, but only half of it, you're allergic to peanuts, you can still have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, just no peanut butter. You like jelly, don't you? And you like bread, right? That's a key component to a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I know you enjoy it. Right, but it's the combination of things that I like. Yes, but don't have them. But you can still have jelly sandwiches if you want to. Or if you don't like calling them jelly sandwiches, call them peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, hold the peanut butter. Like saying, go to Sturgis but don't go to bars. That makes about as much sense as a PB&J hold the PB. So, But it makes sense. It's logically true and scientifically sound. Yes, but people aren't doing that. And they're not going to do that. And they're going to question why they're supposed to do that. Even if you explain it to them, they'll get it wrong. Or they'll explain it to their friends wrong. So, ultimately, can you have Sturgis? Really? No, you can't. And quite honestly, maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's prejudicial. I'm judging people too harshly and painting with too broad a brush. But if you're going to say, all right, these instructions can be followed and be safe. We can have a Sturgis, don't gather in indoor, and there's plenty of alternatives. You could have outdoor beer halls. It is the summer after all, and they probably have plenty of them, and they're probably better for you than the indoor spaces, but you're still packing a lot of people in, and you are sort of enclosing the space because generally speaking, you're looking to make money, charge admission here. There has to be some barrier to just open air, and presumably laws don't permit for necessarily just open air alcohol serving. Maybe that's something we need to change. People bent the laws for alcohol throughout the pandemic to try and make things better or safer on the whole. But at any rate, if you're telling people something nuanced, like, yes, you can have Sturgis, but there's this, there's this, there's this. Now, you can still ride your motorcycles together in great numbers. You can still gather together even and drink beer or any alcohol you want. Just do it outside. Maybe that'll work. But, again, don't impede airflow. Just all of these things are very important. And there's a scientific basis for all of them, you see. And if you just sit down and understand the scientific basis, and then they say, you're addressing a biker rally. I mean, again, there could be a biker rally full of scientific geniuses, for all I know. But on the whole, you'll probably find fewer scientific geniuses at the bike rally than you might expect to find, let's say, in the population as a whole, chosen at random. Okay, right? So does it become dangerous to say, well, you can have Sturgis, you just got to have it safely? You're talking to people who, for years were at the forefront of, you can't tell me to wear a helmet, right? I mean, they're riding there on unprotected, open, motor vehicles that can travel at great rates of speed and offer zero crash protection to people whatsoever. And there's no way to attach you to the vehicle. And look, it's people who don't pay a great deal of attention to safety or rules or anything of the sort. And that's sort of the nature of the gathering. But they'll do it because their own health is at stake. And so is the health of everybody else. And they might pay attention to their own health, but certainly not very much attention to other people's health. So I don't know. I would say no to the Sturgis thing. Maybe even this summer, but they're not going to listen to me. Of course, there's somebody running for president based on we have Sturgis. And it might even work. So you never know. You're just not going to get a lot of cooperation. All right, let's see. Other issues to move on to. There are many, and some of them are the same ones that Greg brought up that we might want to examine in greater detail. But let's get to a roundup of some of the stories we haven't touched on yet. Here's a fun one for those of you who have been waiting for this for a long time. Perhaps justice in one way or one form or another may one day come for Jacob Wall. No one has been willing or able to hold him to account to date, even though he is one of the biggest crimers around. This time, the New York Attorney General is our great hope here. New York AG sues Jacob Wall for $2.75 million over robocalls. Now, I don't think he's got access to $2.75 million to pay any judgment with. And I would have hoped to see him facing criminal liability instead, because while you can lessen the impact of losing a civil judgment against you by declaring bankruptcy and not paying, just generally, it's harder to get out of. You're guilty of this crime and are going to jail, and I would rather see that. Justin Rohrlich writes this up for the Daily Beast. Here's the bottom line. New York Attorney General Letitia James announced last Thursday, that her office has filed a lawsuit against bumbling, right-wing conspiracy theorists Jacob Wall and Jack Berkman over robocalls the pair allegedly made to suppress the black vote ahead of the 2020 presidential election. I don't think we heard a great deal about this one. I'm sure it was reported, and we just didn't really mention it. There was a time when there was a rash of Jacob Wall stories sitting in pocket, and there was just too much happening with pandemic and everything else for us to spend a great deal of time on that. But now we can catch up with what's going on. I didn't realize that he had involved himself in these robocalls, but we should have guessed it. If you had asked me Would Jacob Wall spend any of his time trying to suppress the black vote around Election Day? I'd say, sure, of course. And so he did. So here's what they did. They used robocalls, I guess, and they must have done it in New York if she's suing there based on her being the New York Attorney General. Yeah, it says 5,500 New Yorkers, I guess, got these calls. And here's the text of the call. It says, "Hi, this is Tamika Taylor from Project 1599, which I guess is their attempt at sounding like, well, this must be something like the 1619 project, which I understand to be an examination, the idea being people will understand that to have been an examination of history from a more, from a black perspective, certainly from a more sympathetic to critical race theory perspective, I suppose, if you really want to break things down into the labels they're hanging on everything. So Project 1599, which I'm sure isn't a thing and has nothing to do with anything. And then they gave somebody maybe a name that might possibly be mistaken for that of an African-American activist, perhaps. You get what they're doing here? This is Tamika Taylor. Is there such a person? I don't know. Actually, let me Google this stuff. I'm just sort of curious about this. I mean, were they impersonating somebody else, or were they just giving somebody a name that they thought would work, or what exactly? No real clear answer on this one. I mean, there are people named Tamika Taylor. There's no reason to believe that they would be making these phone calls to you. I don't think that was supposed to be the point. And then what did they call it? Project 1519? Or from 99, Project 1599. And then mostly it just leads to stories about these guys being charged. So, yeah, sounds like it was something that they just made up in the hopes that people would mistake it for the 1619 project. So, hi, this is Tamika Taylor from Project 1599, the civil rights organization founded by Jack Berman, which is supposed to be, I guess, Jack Berkman, and Jacob Wall. And so it's funny. I'm sure they'll say, well, we were very open about the fact that it was us. We put our name right in the call. We weren't hiding from it. But I think the understanding there was that people would say, I don't know who Jacob Wall is. I don't know who Jack Berkman is. I don't even know who Tamika Taylor is. I'm not clear on what Project 1599 is, but the totality is supposed to make it sound like, well, Tamika, Project, it's got some numbers in there that and there's 4 digits. It sounds kind of like a year. It's not that far off of 1619. It's 20 years difference. And then, of course, Jacob Berkman or Jack Berkman and Jacob Wall, I have no idea who they are, but they say they are a civil rights organization founded by these guys. They are not a civil rights organization. There is no Project 1599, etc. So that's the premise here. So that's what the automated recordings told the targeted voters, and then the instructions came along. So first, Tamika, she says she's from this thing. She says, mail-in voting sounds great, but did you know that if you vote by mail, your personal information will be part of a public database that will be used by police departments to track down old warrants and be used by credit card companies to collect outstanding debts? The CDC is even pushing to use records for mail-in voting to track people for mandatory vaccines. Don't be finessed into giving your private information to the man, because that's what everybody's walking around saying. It's a very hip lingo, you see. Don't be finessed into giving your private information to the man. Stay home safe and beware of vote by mail. So you see what they're trying to do here is, of course, think of anything they can do to scare black voters into staying away from mail-in voting. James, the Attorney General, of course, says 5,500 New Yorkers were affected. She's asking for Wall and Berkman to pay $500 for each violation and forfeit all profits. I don't know if there were any or not. If successful, they will be on the hook for $2.75 million in addition to the felony charges that they face in other states for the alleged scheme. That's good news. And there's a link to previous reporting from Salon about that. Headline being very interesting. Jacob Wohl and Jack Berkman hit with 15 new felony charges one day after testifying in related case. So, okay, a lot of states are onto them for that, and I would like to see some actual accountability for once, not just embarrassment for these guys, and because they don't feel embarrassment. Wohl and Berkman have a history of failed schemes, of course, including an attempt to pin false sexual assault allegations on now U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, former special counsel Robert Mueller, and Senator Elizabeth Warren. That is, false sexual assault allegations on all three of them were taken up at some point by these two idiots. And, about time for the two of them to spend some time in prison, so I remain hopeful there. Okay, let's see. A couple other stories that we might squeeze in just before our break. This is an interesting one. How about this for coronavirus news? Washington Post reports this one. Scientists may have found a new coronavirus rapid testing method. Bees. That's right, bees. The bees that are in short supply, and we have to be very careful about making sure that their colonies don't collapse. Well, they're very useful for a lot of things, including apparently coronavirus testing. And there's this picture illustrating the methodology, and it appears that we are enslaving the bees. I feel bad about this, but that's what it looks like. Basically, they've strapped this bee down in this picture. It's like a little, I didn't even know you could do this, but I guess if you miniaturize your operation, it can work. Here's the way it goes, just so it's not so confusing. But you'll be able to picture this in your head once you figure out how it works. Marissa Iati, I-A-T-I, reporting this again for the Washington Post. The fight against the coronavirus pandemic has scientists tapping an unlikely resource, the finely tuned olfactory sense of bees. And I feel like that there's lots more of refined olfactory senses out there. Dutch researchers on Monday said they have trained honeybees to stick out their tongues when presented with the virus's unique scent, acting as a kind of rapid test. Although it's a less conventional method than lab tests, the scientists said teaching bees to diagnose the coronavirus could help fill a gap in low-income countries with limited access to more sophisticated technology like materials for polymerase chain reaction tests, or PCR, if I've pronounced polymerase correctly. We'll just stick with PCR tests. Not all laboratories have that, especially in smaller income countries, said Wim Vanderpoel, a professor at, Wageningen University. Oh my goodness, I don't know how you pronounce it. Wageningen. It's a Dutch university. I assume he's Dutch. She's Dutch. I don't even know. Doesn't even identify. Difficult and irrelevant. Anyway, they led the research at this crazy university. It's a fine university, I'm sure. I just can't pronounce it. Bees are everywhere, and the apparatus is not very complicated. How does it work? The scientists trained roughly 150 bees with a Pavlovian conditioning method in which they gave the insects a sugar water solution each time they were exposed to the smell of coronavirus. When the bees were presented with a sample that was negative for the virus, they received no reward. You see how this would work, right? After repeatedly extending their tongues, technically called proboscises, for the sugar water, the scientists said the bees learned to stick out their tongues for a positive sample, even with no reward offered. Within hours, the insects were trained to identify a virus a few seconds after encountering it, the researchers said. While the research continues, Vanderpoel said the scientists believe they can achieve about a 95% accuracy rate if they use multiple insects to sniff each sample. Their results have not yet been published or peer-reviewed, or for that matter, be reviewed. I don't know what the bees think about this, but I feel like they are going to object to their being pressed into service. And, of course, it is an interesting idea, like the idea of, well, if you are in a resource-poor area and you don't have these high-tech labs, all you got to do is, what? Run out and dive into a colony of bees and risk being stung and strap the bees down to little tiny chairs and then wave these swabs in front. They really do have little apparatus. I don't know how expensive it is to make a little bee straitjacket, but I guess that's something we'll have to think about. Very curious. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's hear more about the enslavement of bees around the world for coronavirus testing. I hope they do eventually give these guys the sugar water that they were craving. Obviously, I don't know. I feel bad about this in some way, and I don't know. Well, do you think at some point in the far future we could find out that this sort of Pavlovian training is inhumane in some way or another? I mean, I imagine the bees would rather be doing something else, but I don't know how bad we're supposed to feel about strapping the bees down and putting them to work. And the Dutch researchers may be very ethical people for all I know, and they don't make the bees work more than 8 hours in a day, and they get perhaps honey breaks at some point during the day. But I think once you get a bee strapped down, the idea of letting them go for a 15-minute honey break and then getting them back in the chair seems unlikely, but it seems so unlikely that you would be able to strap a bee down in the first place. You really got to see this picture of this, you know, the setup. All right. Anyway, so I think you get the basic idea. They train the bees, and it's something they can do within a couple of hours. I don't know how long bees live. So you're replacing your workforce fairly frequently, I think. I don't know if we're compensating the colony for the lost honey-making time that these guys are spending sticking out their tongues at coronavirus samples. But I don't know. We may have to work out the ethics of this after the fact. It's an emergency, everybody. So let's see. Where were we? Right. Oh, so if you strap down enough bees and wave the swabs in front of them, you can get about a 95% accuracy rate, which I think is no worse than any of the super sophisticated chemical tests out there. And let's see. So some more commentary from Vanderpool saying, our first goal was to demonstrate that we could train bees to do this, and that's where we succeeded. And we are now calculating, and we are continuing the work to see how sensitive the method is. And interesting, too, because you got to get researchers who aren't allergic to bees, I guess. So a little bit of screening that has to go into that. The idea for the research sprang from the founders of Dutch insect technology startup. There you go. That's a niche. Dutch insect technology startup sector. Seems small, but you'd be surprised about what they're doing there in the Netherlands. So the company is called Insect Sense, like with no space. Insect Sense, one word. Who had previously used bees, this is interesting too, to detect mineral-rich ore and landmines. That is pretty amazing, and I guess they was, like drug-sniffing dogs, bomb-sniffing dogs, all of which are so cute and helpful, and you're not supposed to interfere with them but while they're working. But bees, I don't know. I don't know where the idea came from, but it makes some sense. I mean, if you know that they have these highly developed olfactory senses, The only question is, can they be trained? So interesting too. You can train them to detect underground minerals and underground bombs, all the underground things they're willing to do. When staff realized they could also train bees to find the coronavirus, they looped in the university researchers. Each time the scientists wanted to train a new set of bees, they used a refrigerator, or the natural external temperature, to cool them down and make them less active, Vanderpool said. That's so you don't get stung a lot, right? They put the bees in harnesses so they would stay still while confronted with the samples, which consist of the respiratory material from a nasal swab mixed with chemicals, which presumably don't change the smell of what's on the swab. So, I mean, that's some job, right? How would you like it if you're strapped to a chair for X number of hours a day and they wave dirty tissues in front of your face and you either stick out your tongue or you don't? The bees smelled samples from both minks and humans. Okay. Remember, they had that huge problem with the minks, and I think that was in the Netherlands, right? And they were similarly good at identifying the virus in both situations, Vanderpool said. I wonder what coronavirus smells like. I don't think I would want to find out. But Insect Sense is working on a machine that could train... Why don't you work on a machine that can detect the virus? Nope. The machine they're working on is a machine that would train multiple bees simultaneously to make the diagnosis. I mean, I guess it makes sense. But, like, you can't figure out what the bees are doing and put that in a machine. But, all right, it's a bee training machine. There you go. At least it's making things easier. Look, I don't have one. You can get a robot to vacuum your house. Fine. A robot that trains bees to diagnose / smell coronavirus. What else? This will worry all of the conspiracy theorists. They are also working on a biochip. I'm not sure what that is, but it sounds like something that's going to make 5G people freak out. That would use genes from the cells that bees smell with to detect the virus. So cells from their proboscis. No, not their proboscis. The proboscis is what they're sticking out to get the sugar water. What are they smelling with? I don't know what bee noses are like, or if they even have them, but they've got some area that smell receptors on something. Anyway, that method would circumvent the need to use live insects, which Vanderpool said might be impractical on a large scale, or the bees may protest. So that seems like a good thing. A biochip that would use genes, that's got all the warning flags for the lunatics. But anyway, so you wouldn't have to inconvenience bees any longer, and they could go on about their honey making and pollinating business. If this is going to work, it can be very fast and very cheap, Vanderpool said, and that would be very convenient. We hope it would be cheap, and I guess that means the idea is that you could give those biochips or sell them cheaply to labs in countries where the materials for the PCR tests were considered either rare or hard to come by or too expensive. Although, again, no guarantee that they'll be able to sell them for cheap because you're talking about pharmaceutical companies. But maybe in the Netherlands they can control for these things. While researchers are also examining whether dogs could be used, that I would have thought that would be their first go-to. Dogs could be used to detect the coronavirus. Vanderpool said he thought scientists could more easily test samples with several bees than several dogs, given the relative ease of handling bees. That rhymes. So like a Dr. Seuss thing, so you know it's bad. The relative ease of handling bees by Dr. Seuss. That's the treatise that's been written on the subject. A study published by the University of Pennsylvania last month, that weird Dutch name, University of Pennsylvania, last month suggested that dogs can detect the coronavirus with 96% accuracy. So that's good. The problem is if you have several dogs strapped to things, or even not strapped to things, and smelling samples, the bees are probably doing the same as the dogs in that they're probably just peeing and pooping all over the place. But it's that much more obvious and malodorous when large mammals are doing it than small insects. We don't even know. I mean, bee vomit is honey. We love that. So, it's one thing. If we were all thinking, dog turds, delicious, like Tootsie Rolls, that might be a different situation. But it's not. Bees. All right. Dirk de Graaf, like the Van de Graaff generator, except not Van, Dirk. Dirk de Graaf, a professor who studies bees at Ghent University, not in the Netherlands, but close by in Belgium, because Ghent, told Reuters he was skeptical that the coronavirus sniffing bees would replace lab tests. It is a good idea, but I would prefer to carry out tests using the classic diagnostic tools rather than using honeybees for this. I am a huge bee lover, but I would use the bees for other purposes than detecting COVID-19. I mean, is that a useful comment? I mean, I would prefer to use the classic tests. Yes, well, what about where you can't? Well, then I would use bees. Okay. Thanks, Dirk. In addition to identifying diseases, animals, including dogs, wasps, and grasshoppers, have long been used to detect explosives. Researchers working for the U.S. Department of Defense began to study the concept known as insect sniffing in the late 1990s. They needed a better word for that, too. We're not sniffing the insects. It's the insects doing the sniffing. And, of course, dogs aren't insects. But, okay, you get the idea. Wasps and grasshoppers. I presume, grasshoppers, that would be nice. They don't sting. Bees do sting, but less aggressively than wasps. Can we use the murder hornets for anything in any of this? I mean, that would be fine if we, worked them to death. I think we'd be okay with that. All right. What else have we got to investigate here? Is there more of this? There was another story or two linked here at the bottom. You know how the Washington Post and every other outlet suggests further reading. This one is sort of kind of related. You can see why it's connected. The other story is not so much. Bar owner charged with selling fake coronavirus vaccine cards in one of the first cases of its kind. The Wall Street Journal, too, has been very aggressively promoting on Twitter their story of airlines now having to confront people showing up with counterfeit vaccine cards and trying to figure out how to detect when they are counterfeit and what to do about it when it happens. I mean, I think everybody predicted that would eventually be the outcome of this thing, but now we're there, and I want to at least raise your awareness of that being the case. I'll open up the bar owner charged with selling fake cards story just so that I can put it in the roundup for you to be aware of. And if you're looking for, if you're looking for a counterfeit card, don't go to the Old Corner Saloon anymore because they've arrested that guy. Where was he? In California's Central Valley, the bar offers, or at least used to, I guess the bar's still open, free pool, weekend karaoke, and a regular ladies' night. That's all for the good. It's the fake coronavirus vaccination cards that are bad. It doesn't say in the initial paragraph where the bar is. Not that they're still selling the things, but, I don't know if they want to really advertise the location. Everyone will start going there looking for neighboring bars that might have come up with the idea as well or copied the idea off of them, even though it landed that guy in big trouble. All right, let's see. There's other things. I didn't think we would spend quite so long on the bees, but it's a very interesting story, really. All right, let's see. You know what? I can take a moment here as we transition to other stories to thank some new donors who actually joined us over the weekend and just today as well. So 2 new Patreon donors, Suleiman Hassan, thank you for joining us on Patreon, and a new one under the online type handle of Hipster Bitch. It's not my fault. That's the name that this person chose for themselves. And, well, we'll just go with that because that's, I think, actually how you would want to be identified, as opposed to giving out the real name, that she might not object to that. But we'll go with the identifier entered into the system. So thanks to Suleiman and Hipster Bitch, both, for joining us as recurring Patreon donors, and I think that still keeps us up to date on these things. I love the ability to, it's a lot easier to do one or two people at a time rather than the whole list. I feel very guilty about having waited for as long as I did. So thanks to everybody. Also, by the way, I don't know whether we'll be able to get to it today because I actually kind of have to run pretty soon after the show, but as promised, Gil has sent me the first of the first of what I hope will be many audio contributions to be used not as content for the show, but as those breaks. He's so sick of hearing my still original recording of the, and you know, I really set myself up for this when I recorded that one appeal for those of you listening to, you know, send your articles in or even record yourself reading articles that either you wrote or that you found interesting, things you want to be part of the show. I set myself up by starting off, I guess the first message that I recorded was about, you know, Patreon donations or whatever donations system. We might have been talking about recurrency way back when. And then a few days, weeks, I don't know, later, I had one for making contributions to the content of the show. And because it was the second one, I said, let's change things up a little bit by talking about how you can contribute to the show other than a monetary contribution for support. And then I stuck with that recording because it, you know, was doing the job, right? For however, you know, 800 years. And of course, then I realized after a while that it starts with let's change things up. And the thing hasn't been changed up in 10 years. So Gil suggested that I change it. And I suggested, why don't you change it, Gil? And Gil said, all right, I will. And he sent me a nice recording that I will put together and try to drop that musical background in there and engineer it. Hopefully by tomorrow we'll be able to actually change things up. And it was very nicely done, totally in the spirit of the show as well. So you have that to look forward to. How about that? Not only does it save me work, you're actually looking forward to my next, I guess, what passes for commercials in this podcast. So thanks to all of our contributors and all of our contributors who make it possible to appeal to the rest of you to be contributors. Thanks to Gil, along with Hipster Bitch and Suleiman. Thanks, guys. All right, got another 15 minutes or so to bring you some of the other interesting and amazing stories, and so many to go with here. Let me see. What's top of the list? Some things I think better suited perhaps to discussing with Joan. I think she now returns from vacation tomorrow, so we should hear from her. And we can share a couple of these stories. But the other ones, Vox has got a bunch of stuff here of some. Maybe we'll close out with more additions to the burgeoning big lie genre, as we did last week. So we'll add today Zach Beauchamp's piece from Vox. The big lie is the GOP's one and only truth. A lot of these things essentially approaching the same big problem from slightly different angles. And I think it deserves examination from several different ones because it's a complex and weird issue. Representative Liz Cheney, you know who she is, the third-ranking Republican in the House, is set to be stripped of her leadership post. I understand the news on that front this morning is that Kevin McCarthy has finally said, okay, I'm actually for doing that. And that probably pretty much seals her fate. Her crime, of course, voting to impeach Trump and then subsequently continuing to rebuke his big lie that the 2020 election was somehow stolen. In this, Cheney is hardly alone. At the national and state level, Republicans who challenged Trump's big lie, ranging from Senator Mitt Romney of Utah all the way down to a member of the Michigan State Board of Canvassers, have either been formally punished or publicly rebuked. The party may not agree on much internally nowadays, but on this point they march in lockstep. Trump's falsehoods about the election must not be challenged. This is not what Joe Biden seemed to think would happen. During the campaign, he predicted that you will see an epiphany occur among many of my Republican friends if Trump were defeated. In December, long after it was clear that Trump was standing by his false claims of a stolen election, Biden told supporters, "You're going to be surprised by how reasonable Republicans could be." Although he added, "I may eat those words eventually." And I guess it's now time to start thinking about what proteins and starches he might want to accompany those words. The events of the past few months have confirmed that Biden's public optimism was indeed misplaced, although there is the possibility that it was performative. I guess you could think about that. But at any rate, he's woken up to a couple of things lately and reacted relatively swiftly and in a positive direction on a lot of things and surprised a lot of people. So the events of the past few months have confirmed that Biden's public optimism was indeed misplaced. Republicans cannot tell the truth about the 2020 election, nor treat him as a fully legitimate president. Trump's hold over the party is too powerful. Somehow, I really can't explain that for you. His big lie, widely believed among Republican voters and activists alike. You may have seen the clip being circulated over the weekend of a CNN reporter talking to people who went to one of the rallies in the new Hands All Over America tour, as I'm calling it. Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene somehow teaming up as the two biggest idiots in the Republican Party and apparently planning a tour of the dumbest places in America, I would guess, where they will rally people to their cause, which appears to be, I guess, personal perversion of one sort or another, because there's no other reason why anyone would rally to the side of those two in particular. But okay, back to the story here. This state of affairs, the culmination of years of Republican attacks on both the Democratic Party and the legitimacy of the electoral system itself, is dangerous, and it raises a disturbing question. Is the Republican Party even capable of treating a Democratic president as legitimate? And if not, are we heading for future electoral crises dwarfing even the disaster of 2020? And the answer, I think everybody knows, is now yes. The next question is there any reason to stop at president? And is there any reason to believe that the Republican Party is capable or will allow itself to treat the election of any Democrat as legitimate, no matter where? And I guess the first test of that will be 2022. So he continues with this story here. The big lie is now, of course, GOP gospel. Cheney is not alone in suffering consequences for challenging Trump's allegations. Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who defended the state's counting process against Trump's attempts to interfere with it, was stripped of his voting power on the state election board as part of Georgia's new voting restrictions law. In a House special election in Texas held in early May, the Trump-critical Republican in the race, Michael Wood, got 3% of the vote. In January, Michigan Republicans removed Aaron Van Langeveld, a GOP attorney who broke with the party to certify Biden's victory in Michigan, from his post on the state's board of state canvassers. At the Utah Republican Party's convention this weekend, Senator Mitt Romney, perhaps the GOP's leading Trump critic, was booed and called a traitor. At the same time, Republicans who have embraced falsehoods about the election have been elevated. Representative Elise Stefanik, who's likely to replace Cheney in the number 3 spot, backed Trump's anti-election efforts to the hilt. Most egregiously, she falsely asserted that there were 140,000 illegal votes in Georgia's Fulton County alone, which would amount to more than 25% of all the votes in the entire Democratic-leaning county. The breakout Republican stars of the House of Representatives, Representatives Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, both egged on the January Stop the Steal rally that culminated in the attack on Capitol Hill. There's a similar pattern at the state level. Arizona Republican Party Chair Kelly Ward, who filed lawsuits seeking to overturn the 2020 election results in her state, won her January re-election bid for party leadership. Texas State Representative Briscoe Cain, one of those amazingly fake-sounding names, who flew to Pennsylvania to litigate on Trump's behalf. Remember him? I think he showed up in a cowboy hat, and we saw his tweet. Something dumb about it, but Briscoe Cain, yes, who flew to Pennsylvania to litigate on Trump's behalf, was made chairman of the House Elections Committee in the state legislature there, where he is currently pushing a series of, you guessed it, voter suppression bills. Remaining in the GOP's good graces requires that elected officials either actively embrace lies about 2020 or, at the very least, refuse to condemn them. As a result, 2020 conspiracy theories are exerting a dominant influence on the party, shaping both legislation and the base's worldview. Across the country, state legislators have introduced over 360 bills that restrict voting rights, per account of the Brennan Center on Justice by them. Did I read that out correctly? All right. Well, at any rate, the majority of which aim to restrict absentee voting in one way or another. Several have already been enacted, including in key states like Georgia and Florida. The restrictions on mail-in balloting, pushed primarily by Republicans, are not especially strategic. It's not clear either party benefits more from expanded remote voting, but the bills serve as a way of codifying Trump's false claims that these ballots were the key source of Democratic fraud, the reason why he lost and Biden won. Trump's lies are changing our nation's laws. I mean, that's a bad thing. And polling has consistently found Republican voters take Trump's view of the election. An April poll from Reuters Ipsos is a representative example. It found that 60% of Republicans agreed that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, with 55% saying the result came from, quote, illegal voting and or election rigging, unquote. From top to bottom, the GOP has been conquered by the big lie. Much as North Korean state press proclaims that Kim Jong-il invented the hamburger. I didn't realize that was the case. Republicans must now proclaim that something was fishy about Joe Biden's victory. This dire outcome was not inevitable. The best evidence we have suggests that the rise of the big lie is the direct result of strategic choices by Republican leaders. A new paper by Dan Hopkins, a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania, 2 calls for them today, analyzes data from a panel survey which looks at roughly the same group of people over time, running between 2007 and 2020. The survey asked people to rate the fairness of the U.S. electoral system on a scale of 1 to 5 and track the changes over time. What they found was striking consistency. Support for the American system is both high and reasonably stable when assessed via this measure, Hopkins writes, though there are some fluctuations, with partisans evaluating the system as somewhat less fair when the other party is in power. Generally, they're small. Hopkins' last survey wave was in October 2020, which means that the results don't reflect the false allegations lobbed in the aftermath of Biden's victory. The stability documented here was very likely shattered by Trump's post-election actions, Hopkins concludes. Other data confirm this supposition. A report from the Voter Study Group analyzed Pew surveys conducted after every presidential election since 2004 on whether voters thought their vote was counted fairly. You see the same general stability documented in Hopkins' paper, with the majority of voters in both parties saying that they were very confident their vote was counted accurately in every year except 2020. Taken together, these two results suggest that there's nothing natural about voters believing elections were rigged against them. In fact, even when their party loses, both Republicans and Democrats have historically believed the process was generally fair and the outcome basically legitimate. The obvious explanation, as Hopkins notes, is when it comes to the 2020 election, the Republican elites were leading the voters, not the other way around. Recent shifts in public opinion were thus not a primary engine of the Trump's presidency's anti-democratic efforts or of their violent conclusion, he writes. Such stability suggests understanding the precipitating causes of those efforts requires attention to other actors, including activists and elites. The implication of this research is that we are stuck in a dangerous pattern. Trump's pronouncements, endorsed and spread by a number of prominent Republicans, radicalized the base, undermining faith in democracy itself. Republicans inclined to challenge this view realize they're out of step with the party and mostly stay quiet. Those that do speak up publicly, like Cheney or Raffensperger, get marginalized or stripped of their power. This weakens the constituency to challenge any future lies from Trump and other like-minded Republicans. It's a one-way ratchet where a faction of the GOP elite, led by Trump, pushes the party further and further down an anti-democratic road, and there's no obvious way to stop it. He goes on to write a section entitled Get Ready for Another Possible Crisis Like 2020, and that is actually the conclusion of the article. We can't read that section of it. Perhaps you can give it your time off the air later on. We'll continue, of course, to fill in the gaps as they exist and as people write on the subject. And I guess people are really believing it. That CNN interviewer found the people in the rally at the parking lot saying, he was telling them, all of your claims have been debunked. And their basic answer was, no, they weren't. I saw it on TV. And we've got a lot of work to do and a long way to go. Justice Putnam picks up the ball next. I'll tell you what's up after this.
Networksradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, starting down in Florida, Representative Charlie Crist said the state's new voter suppression law doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I think we all agree with that. Charlie Crist apparently considering running for governor down there in Florida once again. That and much more from around the country and around the world, as always, with Justice Putnam next.